In 2018, a gunman opened fire inside the Stone and Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. This tragic event, named the Parkland shooting, soon turned into a debate as both scientists and politicians scrambled to find the cause of the shooting. Former U.S. President Donald Trump blamed the shooting on violent video games. This led to controversy regarding the effects of violent video games on real-life violence. Hello, my name is Bhargav V, and this controversy led to the curiosity of asking the question, do violent video games cause violence? Specifically, how do violent video games affect the overall mental and social well-being of American teenage boys? Well, an oversimplified answer to this question is violent video games positively affect the social and mental well-being of American teenagers by having the potential to improve social skills such as communication and learning and reduce the chance or effects of mental illness. Video games have the potential to improve social skills by making teenagers better at communication and teamwork. For example, according to results of an experiment conducted by Ankit Badotala, playing video games can bolster teamwork and team performance when played cooperatively. Most video games are cooperative, where players are placed into teams where they must communicate with one another in order to win the game. The picture on the right shows a team holding a wire with player 5 attempting to connect the wire. This wire in the picture resembles the importance of every single team member in the part of the team. It shows that every team member must pitch in order to guarantee the team's success. This message can be learned from video games and applied to the real world so that teenagers can understand the importance of effective communication and proper teamwork. Video games can also benefit the cognitive skills of the players. For example, the picture on the right shows a brain scan done on players of video games and players of people who do not play video games. And the brain scan, especially on the top one, shows brain scans of the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the region of the brain that deals with memory and learning. And the graph next to the picture shows that the training group, which was the group that played video games, had more gray matter in their hippocampuses, and gray matter means that their brains are more plastic and susceptible to change, meaning that the training group, or the ones that played video games, were able to learn better and take in more information and memorize better. The picture on the right shows how video games can actually affect the learning of people. And it has been shown in the graph that both response learners and spatial learners can both improve their learning skills by playing video games. This shows that the video games can appeal to a lot of people. And because video games appeal to a lot of people, they have went from being just a leisurely recreational activity to becoming a major competitive sport. For example, according to the stimulus source taking college esports seriously, today there are more than 70 programs with over $9 million of scholarship money in the collegiate scene. This means that even colleges and academic institutions are understanding and acknowledging the importance of video games and are understanding the benefits that they bring to players. Also, it would not make sense for academic institutions and universities to advocate, support, and fund an activity or hobby that has been known to cause violence among the people, which thereby implies that violent video games may not cause violence in the real world. Video games can also be used to improve the mental health of teenagers. For example, according to social scientist Christian Jones, video games have been used as a means of relaxation and stress reductions because of its capabilities as a method of letting off steam. According to the chart on the right, it shows that playing video games is the #1 way teens deal with stress, with around 46% of teens playing video games to deal with their problems, which is more than playing sports or watching movies. This shows that since an overwhelmingly large amount of teens play video games to deal with stress, along with backing from scientific research, it shows that video games can be an effective outlet for and a coping mechanism for stress. Also, violent video games can also be used to potentially decrease violence in the real world, because if a teen is, for example, feeling stressed or angry, they can take out those emotions and frustrations internally on a video game, which helps them cool down, which makes them less likely to take out those emotions in the real world. However, despite all of this evidence, some skeptics still believe that violent video games causes gun violence among the population. For example, according to the American Psychological Association, there's an association between violent video games and increases in aggressive behavior. Also, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, they found a positive correlation between playing video games and increased feelings of aggression, hostility, angry feelings, and aggressive thoughts. However, it is important to note that the evidence shown on the previous slide are mere correlations, and as any scientist would say, correlation does not equal causation. In order to prove a causation effect between two stimuli, one must set up an experiment in which the independent and dependent variables are clearly stated, in which all extraneous variables are properly controlled and accounted for, and in an experiment where a single or double-blind procedure may need to be implemented in order to prevent any bias in the experiment. And as the 106th Congress of the United States Senate would say, there is little experimental evidence that the violent content of violent video games can increase aggression. This shows that just because violent video games and violence are correlated with one another does not mean that one causes the other. And this is clearly seen in the visual on the right, which shows a positive correlation between ice cream consumption and sunburn rates. So would it be fair to say that eating ice cream causes sunburns? No, that would be ridiculous. The reason why there's a positive correlation between ice cream consumption and sunburns is because of the weather, which causes sunburns and which makes people want to eat ice cream more. This simplified example shows that just because two things are related to one another does not mean that one is the result of another. So, since violent video games are not the cause of real-life violence, then why are they blamed so much for it? Well, a simple answer for this is because violent video games are an easy target to blame. For example, according to Alan Koppenhaver, violent video games are unfairly scapegoated as the source of school shootings because blaming violent video games causes a moral panic among the public. And historically, it has been seen that usually politicians are the ones who blame violent video games for real-world violence. And politicians may do this in a tactic called blame avoidance, where they pass the blame on from their political perspective onto another weaker target. For example, the picture on the right shows a bunch of big people pointing their fingers at a weaker and smaller target in order to pass the blame on from them onto the other person. And this kind of is what's happening in the whole violent video game dilemma, where politicians are passing the blame onto violent video games in order to push their own agendas. For example, the NRA, which is a pro-gun association, really benefits from the decreased regulations of firearms. And decreased regulations of firearms could be one of the potential causes for gun violence. But since the NRA is so interconnected in today's politics, politicians who are endorsed by the NRA and who are associated with it will be less likely to blame the NRA and more likely to avoid the blame and pass it on to an easier target, such as violent video games, so that their political party and platform does not get scrutinized. So in conclusion, violent video games are not the cause of real-world violence, but instead, when played at a moderate rate, actually have the ability to improve social, cognitive health among high school teenagers. Thank you. Are there any questions?
I do have two questions for you. First question. How did you select the strategies you used to gather the information for your research?
Well, first of all, I kind of made an outline where I laid out my different claims and perspectives. So my three perspectives were actually kind of like a social psychologist perspective, a mental health biology perspective, and a political perspective. So I laid out the three perspectives. I made my claims, and I did my research based off of those claims. So one strategy that I used was I tried to find the most credible sources possible so I can make my argument as strong as possible. So I did this by only using credible sources, credible search engines such as Google Scholar or JSTOR. And those strategies helped me find the best sources to use. And then I read through all of the sources and I made annotated bibliographies, not only looking at my argument, but looking at the opposition argument, because I wanted to find out which one had more evidence. And I believe that the best way to really understand the argument is to look at it from both ways. So I looked at all the different perspectives, and I picked the best evidence to use for my argument and the ones that best kind of blended in with my perspectives.
Okay. And for the second question, explain the level of certainty you have about your conclusion.
I am very certain about my conclusion. because again, as I mentioned previously, I really looked really in depth into the sources to make sure I only picked the credible sources. Um, I'm very certain about this because my sources are credible. I looked at the bibliographies to ensure that the sources that my evidence used is credited, is credible and up to date. I also read the experimental designs because some of mine were experiments. I looked at the design of the experiments to see if they properly controlled it or not. I also looked at my counterclaim. I looked at what the opposition might say. For example, the American Psychological Association said that there was a correlation between violent video games and real life violence. The American Pediatrics also pointed out that correlation, in Harvard Health, which I did not include in this presentation, but it was a part of my bibliography and my paper. They also noticed a correlation trend between violence and violent video games. So I really understood the opposition first, and then I looked at ways that I could kind of undermine the opposition and disprove the opposition. And I did that by making the connection between correlation does not equal causation, and that kind of disproved the main argument of the opposition, which boosts my ability and the credibility of my conclusion, which makes me fairly certain about my findings and the way I did this presentation.